All right, today we're going to finish up talking about how women were treated and how they aided in the war. And then we'll also finish up talking about some of the prisoner of war camps in the Civil War. So we're going to take a look at, like I said, how we aid the war effort, women, and we're going to discuss the conditions endured by the prisoners, which were pretty harsh. So, vocabulary for today, three words for you. First one's counterpart. A counterpart is someone who does something as you do, but on the other team or side. A lot of times when we're playing in sports and we're competing against somebody, whoever we're competing against is our counterpart. So in this case, North versus South. Another vocabulary word is exposure, which are the effects of being without protection from the weather. If we were exposed to the elements in the wintertime, we would not do well. We would probably not survive. And the third vocabulary term is dwarfed, where it's something is made to seem small by comparison. So what are we going to do today? Today we are going to take a look at how women aided the war effort and also discuss the conditions endured by prisoners of war. It says, give an example of suffering from exposure. I want you to think of something, maybe frostbite, maybe sunburn. Name someone who dwarfs you. Anybody who is made seem small by comparison. Maybe it's a baby. And who is Mr. Savi's counterpart? A lot of my counterparts are coaches that I coach against who are actually good friends of mine. A counterpart isn't somebody who has to necessarily be an enemy. A lot of times they can be friends. You know, we can compete against friends, but at the same time, in this setting in the Civil War, we are talking about a group of people who basically don't like each other. Now, things we already know. We had thousands of men in both the North and the South that left their farms and offices to serve in the armed forces. We also know that in the North, Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation led tens of thousands of African Americans to join the Union Army. We also know that before the Civil War, very few women worked outside their homes. So, to begin, we had a lot of men that are away at war, so women in both the North and the South assumed increased responsibilities. Women would plow fields, run farms and plantations. They also took over jobs in offices and factories that had previously been done by men. Like it says here, they did plow the fields, they ran the farms and plantations. This has been pretty common throughout history. We see this again in World War I and World War II. We have political cartoons of people like Rosie the Riveter. She's a lady in a bandana who's flexing her muscles to look tough, be a tough American woman. So they took over jobs in offices and factories, things that have been previously done by men. Once again, this is not just unique to the Civil War. This has happened in World War I and World War II as well. Now, some other social changes actually came about because of the thousands of women who served in the front lines as volunteer workers and nurses. We had some very famous ladies that we will talk about in a little bit here, but they did a lot of great work. Susie King Taylor was an African American woman who wrote an account of her experiences as a volunteer with an African American regiment. She asked her readers to remember that, quote, many lives were lost, not men alone, but noble women as well. Now, a lot of times what happened was these relief agencies, the ones that we would know nowadays would be like the Red Cross or the Salvation Army, but they put women to work washing clothes, gathering supplies, and cooking food for soldiers. Also, nursing became a profession that became very important. It was very respectable for a lot of women. By the end of the war, we had around 3,000 nurses that had worked under the leadership of a lady named Dorothea Dix in the Union hospitals. Southern women were also active as nurses and as volunteers on the front as well. So like I said, battlefield nursing, which used to be done by men, became a profession for women. People respected that, and that's kind of when the societal shift towards nursing became a job that is stereotypically, even today, known for being a job for women. Women also played a key role as spies in both the North and the South. We had Harriet Tubman, who served as a spy for Union forces along the coast of South Carolina. The most famous Confederate spy was a lady named Belle Boyd. And although she was arrested 6 times, she continued her work through much of the war, and at one point she even sent messages from her jail cell by putting them in little rubber balls and tossing them out the window to men who would then carry out her plans. So, what new roles were taken on by women during the Civil War? Choose the one that is not true. Hopefully, you got that one pretty easily. Now, before the Civil War, most of our military nurses were men, like this guy, Walt Whitman, who's a very famous poet. You can see here in the picture that we have men scattered all over. Some of those men are not doing so well if you look at that closely. In the bottom right corner, that is a picture of Walt Whitman. So by the end of the war, like we talked about earlier, we had around 3,000 nurses that worked under the leadership of Dorothea Dix in the Union hospitals. It took a very concerted effort, very organized effort to be able to have all these soldiers cared for. So we needed really good leaders and organizers to make sure that they were all taken care of. Now another one that we've talked about quite a bit is a lady named Clara Barton. She was trained as a school teacher and she started working for the government when the Civil War began. And she organized a relief agency to help with the war effort. And she said, "While our soldiers stand and fight, I can stand and feed and nurse them." So she also made food for soldiers in camp. She tended the wounded and dying on the battlefield, and all in all became kind of a heroine, a female hero of the Civil War. She also made food, like I said, at Antietam. She held a doctor's operating table study as cannon shells burst all around her. The doctor called her the angel of the battlefield, and after the war, Barton actually did start the American Red Cross. There's the rest of that information right there. So there you can see there's Clara working with two soldiers. One looks pretty alert. The other one, with the head bandage, is not doing very well. But these women would take on a lot of risk by doing this, but they were doing what they thought was right. Now another one, Marianne Bickerdike, was a widow who made herbal medicine before the war, and she was very into studying the study of natural medicine, which had the benefits of clean water and cleanliness. That's what they stressed. And she was credited with saving more lives than all the army physicians just because they were drinking water that wasn't going to make them sick and potentially kill them. So Bickerdike volunteered to clean tents. She set up field kitchens and operated army laundries. She brewed hot soups, prepared nutritious meals in field kitchens. And essentially what she did is she made these areas sanitary, clean, and healthy. She was known simply as Mother Bickerdike, and she followed the Union Army and established more than 300 field hospitals to assist sick and wounded soldiers. And during the battles, it was very common to see Mother Bickerdike risk her own life by searching for wounded soldiers on the battlefield, give them what they needed, and then make sure they got aid. Like we already talked about, Susie King Taylor, she was an African American woman. She wrote an account of her experiences as a volunteer with an African American regiment. She married a black soldier, and she moved along with her husband's regiment, serving as nurse and laundress. She also taught a lot of the black soldiers to read and write during their off-duty hours. So she was also very instrumental. Now, as far as actual women between North and South, just like their northern counterparts, we had Southern women that were also active as nurses and as volunteers on the front. That was very, very common. So which of the following women did not serve as a Civil War nurse? There should be one name there that you do not recognize. Then what did Clara Barton do after the war? The answer is right in front of you. One answer only. So like we said, women also played a key role as spies in the North and the South. This is Harriet Tubman. You know her from the Underground Railroad. She served as a spy for Union forces along the coast of South Carolina. And this was the Confederate spy Belle Boyd. Like I said, she was arrested 6 times and she continued her work through much of the war. And after the war, Boyd actually became an actress in England. But in 1869, she came back to the United States and began touring the country. And she would go around to different community groups or schools, colleges, and give very dramatic lectures about her life as a Civil War spy. Now, another woman, this is Rose Greenhow. She was a very popular Washington widow and hostess when the Civil War began, but she used her charm as a lady, or her feminine charms, to pass along to Confederate officials information on the defenses of Washington and Union troop movements. So she was very helpful to the South, even though she technically was inside the Union. Now, she's credited with providing General Beauregard with information resulting in the Union defeat at the First Battle of Bull Run in July of 1861. And before the Union and Confederate armies rejected the enlistment of women, but women really wanted to serve in the army, so they disguised themselves as men and they assumed some different masculine male names. And because many of them successfully passed as men, it was impossible to know with any certainty how many women actually served in the Civil War. There were at least 135 women soldiers that were known to have fought in the Civil War disguised as men, although some estimates, historians believe that the figure could be higher and is close to 400. And of all these brave women fighting on both sides, one of the best known was this woman right here, Sarah Rosetta Wakeman. And if you're looking at this closely, I know the picture is kind of blurry, but it's hard to even tell that that's a woman right in front of you. Wakeman served from April of 1862 and fought in the Battle of Pleasant Hill in April of 1864. And like we've talked about throughout Chapter 17 and even a little bit today, the unsanitary conditions did kill a lot of soldiers, and she was no different. She actually died from dysentery later that year. And no one really knew her true gender until Wakeman's many letters were discovered at home years later on by a different relative. So. Now, in some areas of the country, women formed what were called home guards in order to protect the home front while the men and the boys were gone. That was very common to kind of make sure that their homes and their plantations and things like that wouldn't get destroyed. And some of these groups consisted of teenage girls, young women. They would practice and drill, and they made their own uniforms to look like those worn by their male soldier counterparts. So, which of the following women did not serve as a Civil War spy? Now, when it came to women that were caught spying were thrown into jail, but soldiers that were captured in battle suffered a far more treacherous life. They were thrown in Civil War prison camps. And at these prison camps in both the North and the South, the prisoners of war faced absolutely horrible conditions. We're talking like near Holocaust level conditions, obviously minus the extermination. But I'm talking like, as far as the lack of food, some of the pictures you're about to see are not exactly great, but it's the reality of what they faced. Now, one of the worst prison camps in the North was in Elmira, New York. Perhaps the hardest feature of a prisoner's life at the camp was the New York winter. One prisoner called Elmira an excellent summer prison for Southern soldiers, but an excellent place for them to find their graves in the winter. In just 1 year, more than 24% of Elmira's 12,121 prisoners died of sickness and exposure to the severe weather. This would be no different than if you tried to survive outside in the winter in Wisconsin. It would kill you. Now, conditions were also horrible in the South. The camp with the worst reputation was at a place called Andersonville, Georgia. It was built to hold 10,000 prisoners, and at one point it housed 33,000. So, inmates had very little shelter from the heat or the cold. Most would sleep in holes that were actually scratched out in the dirt. Drinking water came from one tiny creek that also served as their sewer. It was just really, really bad. As many as 100 men a day died at Andersonville from starvation, disease, and exposure. And within a span of a little over a year, 13 months, 13,700 men died in Andersonville. So like I said in the last little bit there, the inmates had very little shelter from the weather. Most of them slept in holes that they would scratch out in the dirt. And the drinking water came from the same creek that they would go to the bathroom in. So, pretty gross. So here's a picture here of a man, a Civil War prisoner. As you can see, he is literally skin and bones. That is, I don't want to show you that too much longer. Here's another one. So people who saw the camps were shocked by the condition of the soldiers. A lot of people just said they look like mummified corpses, mummified, dwindled corpses. So all in all, this was pretty bad. We had around 50,000 men that died in Civil War prison camps alone. But this number was actually dwarfed by the number of dead on the battlefronts and even more from disease in the army camps. In Section 3, starting on Monday, we will take a look at the bloody battles that led to the end of the Civil War. But at this point, the number of bodies between fighting, sickness, and prison camps are really starting to add up. People are getting sick and tired of this war. It's gone on too long. So what were two of the nation's worst Civil War prison camps? You should be able to pick those out pretty easily. And then why did so many soldiers suffer and die behind enemy lines in places like Andersonville, Georgia, and Elmira, New York? Have a good weekend, and I will be back on Monday, and we will look at Section 3, which deals with the battles that turned the tide of the war.